I was already apologizing when it happened. I don't even remember starting. I just know my voice was low, careful, like I was walking across thin ice. I was saying sorry for something, not one clear thing, just everything. The tone mattered more than the words. Everyone in the room was quiet in that way that isn't peaceful, just expectant. "I'm sorry," I said again, slower this time, like if I said it right, it would land better. That's when my son spoke. "You ruined everything anyway." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't sound angry. It came out flat, almost bored, like a sentence he'd practiced and finally found a place to use. The room didn't react the way I expected. No one corrected him. No sharp inhale. No one said his name the way adults do when they mean stop. A chair scraped somewhere behind me. Someone cleared their throat. Someone else looked down at their phone. I stayed standing. Everyone else was sitting. For a second, I thought maybe I'd misheard him. I waited for someone to laugh awkwardly and say, "He didn't mean it like that." I waited for an explanation, a softer version, anything. Nothing came. I felt my mouth still moving, finishing the apology out of habit. The words sounded strange now, like they belonged to someone else. My hands were folded too tightly in front of me. I noticed that before I noticed the way my chest felt. Tight, hollow, almost numb. I looked at my son. He wasn't looking at me. He was staring past me, toward the others, like he was checking whether he'd said the right thing. And they let it sit there, that sentence, like it made sense, like it explained something. I realized, standing there, that this wasn't just between me and him. This was a performance I didn't know I was in. My apology wasn't meant for forgiveness. It was meant to confirm a story everyone else already agreed on. I could have defended myself. I could have asked what he meant. I could have reminded him of things, years, nights, choices, but none of that came out. Instead, I stopped talking. The silence stretched longer than my apology ever had. Heads lifted. Someone shifted uncomfortably. The room changed, just slightly, like they'd lost their footing. I didn't say anything. And that's where everything changed. I didn't always know how to be quiet like that. There was a time when my life was loud in the smallest ways. Alarm clocks before sunrise, the rattle of coins in my purse, the hum of the refrigerator at night when the house was finally still. Noise meant things were moving. Noise meant I was keeping up. I became a single mother without an announcement. No dramatic exit. Just one day realizing it was me doing the mornings, the evenings, the waiting rooms, the permission slips. Me doing the math in my head before every purchase. Me deciding which bills could wait without shutting something off. I learned quickly what mattered and what didn't. Pride didn't. Rest didn't. Being seen didn't. Getting it done did. I packed lunches the night before so mornings wouldn't feel rushed. I memorized what my son liked and didn't like so he wouldn't have to ask twice. I learned how to sound calm on the phone even when I was counting dollars on the table with one hand. When I was tired, I didn't say it. When I was scared, I handled it later, alone. I told myself that's what parents do. They absorb things so their children don't have to feel them. People liked to tell me I was strong. They said it casually, like it was something I'd chosen. What they really meant was that I didn't ask for much, that I didn't interrupt, that I handled my problems quietly. My family helped sometimes, in small, careful ways. Advice came more often than support. Opinions came more often than questions. When they stepped in, it was always framed as concern. When I stepped back, it was framed as distance. No one ever asked how tired I was. Things worked well enough that everyone assumed they always would. When my son did well, it was expected. When something went wrong, it was examined. What I could have done differently, what I should have noticed sooner. I noticed everything. I noticed when my son stopped telling me certain things, when he started checking reactions before answering, when he repeated phrases that didn't sound like his. I told myself it was normal. Kids grow, families change. Gratitude was something I gave freely and received rarely. Not because anyone was cruel, just because it was understood that this was my role, to hold things together, to smooth things over, to make sure nothing spilled. I didn't resent it, not at first. I thought this was what love looked like when it lasted. But somewhere along the way, I became less of a person and more of a function, someone who could be relied on but not listened to, someone whose sacrifices were invisible because they were consistent. And when you're consistent long enough, people stop seeing the effort. They only see the expectation. I didn't realize then that silence had already been assigned meaning, that my steadiness was being mistaken for agreement, that my absence from certain conversations wasn't accidental. I was busy keeping everything from falling apart. I didn't know someone else was deciding why it had to. It didn't happen all at once. That's what made it harder to name. At first, it was small things. Conversations that ended when I walked into the room, plans that had already been adjusted by the time they reached me. I'd hear about decisions after they were made, always explained as practical, reasonable, easier this way. "We didn't think you'd mind," someone said once, not looking at me. Another time, it just made sense. I told myself I was reading too much into it. Families talk, people assume. I didn't want to be the one who turned every shift into a problem. My son started changing in ways I couldn't place right away. Not in his routines, those stayed mostly the same, but in his tone. He listened differently, like he was measuring what to say instead of just saying it. When I asked simple questions, he answered with a caution that didn't belong to his age. "You don't have to worry about it," he said once, repeating it exactly the way someone else must have said it to him. I asked who told him that. He shrugged. "Everyone knows." That word stuck with me. Everyone. I started hearing my own shortcomings described back to me, but in language I didn't recognize. I was overprotective. I was controlling. I made things harder than they needed to be. None of it was said to me directly at first. It floated in the air, carried through pauses and side comments. "She means well," someone said, as if I weren't sitting right there. "She just has her ways." I felt a strange detachment settle in, like watching myself from a distance. I knew I should be upset, but the feeling didn't come. What came instead was confusion, disbelief, the sense that I'd missed a meeting where something important was decided. Messages went unanswered longer than before. When they did come, they were brief, polite. Plans changed last minute. Invitations became optional, then occasional. I tried once, just once, to ask what was going on. The response was immediate and gentle, too gentle. "You're imagining things. Why are you so sensitive lately? No one's against you." I nodded, I smiled, I let it drop. Inside, something went quiet. I realized that whatever this was, it wasn't about one mistake or one argument. It was about a version of me that had already been agreed upon, a story that explained everything neatly without needing my voice in it. And the more I stayed calm, the more that story seemed to fit. I stopped bringing things up. I stopped correcting details. I told myself it was temporary, that things would settle if I didn't escalate. But isolation doesn't always arrive with door slamming. Sometimes it arrives with smiles, with reassurance, with the slow understanding that you are no longer being included in the truth being told about you. I didn't confront anyone. I just listened. And what I heard told me I was already on the outside. The pressure didn't come as anger. That would have been easier to understand. It came as concern, as patience, as that careful tone people use when they've already decided something about you but want to appear kind while saying it. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," someone told me, gently. "We're just trying to help," another added, like a reminder. "You always take things so personally," my son said once, not looking up. I started hearing the same words from different mouths. Difficult, emotional, unstable. Not said directly to me, never that, but wrapped inside softer sentences. We're worried about you. You've been under a lot of stress. Maybe you're not seeing things clearly right now. Every time I tried to explain myself, the explanation became proof of the problem. If I spoke too calmly, I was cold. If my voice shook, I was overwhelmed. If I stayed quiet, I was avoiding accountability. There was no version of me that fit. I noticed how often people spoke about me while I was sitting there, how my feelings were discussed like a condition, how decisions were justified using my supposed reactions instead of my actual words. "She won't handle it well," someone said once. I was right there. I handled it just fine. My past sacrifices started getting rewritten. Staying late at work became neglect. Being careful with money became control. Protecting my son became manipulation. I listened as my intentions were explained to me by people who had never carried them. When I pushed back, even slightly, the room tightened. "Why are you being like this? Can't you just let it go? This is why things don't work out." I learned quickly that silence was safer than honesty, safer than questions, safer than asking for specifics no one wanted to give. So I stayed quiet. I nodded when they spoke. I apologized when things felt tense, even if I wasn't sure why. I told myself that peace mattered more than being right, that keeping things calm was still protecting my son. But the labels didn't stop. They just settled. I could feel myself shrinking in their eyes, becoming smaller, simpler, a problem that needed managing, a personality that needed adjusting. What hurt most wasn't the blame. It was how reasonable they made it sound. I began to understand that my silence wasn't being read as patience, it was being read as confirmation. And the more I stayed quiet, the more certain everyone became that they were right about me. That's when I realized something was about to be decided, whether I spoke or not.
That's when things stopped being abstract. The conversations that used to stay just out of reach started leaving marks. Dates, numbers, emails sent with too many people copied on them, decisions written down instead of talked through. Money came up more often, not in arguments, never that, but in concern. What was affordable? What was realistic? What I could handle? Someone suggested managing things for me, just temporarily, until I got back on my feet. I was already standing. My son's schedule changed. Small adjustments at first. Pickups rearranged. Plans discussed in group messages I wasn't always part of. When I asked, I was told it was easier this way, more stable. "Don't make this a big thing," someone said. "It's not about you." Everything was about me, just never with me. I started noticing how carefully people watched my reactions, like they were waiting for something. Tears, anger, proof. When it didn't come, their concern sharpened into impatience. "You're being strangely calm," someone said once. It wasn't a compliment. My health slipped in ways that were easy to ignore if you weren't living inside my body. I stopped sleeping deeply. Food lost its appeal. My shoulders stayed tight even when I was sitting still. I told myself it was stress, temporary, manageable. Reputation became something I could feel moving without me. Little comments reached me secondhand, questions disguised as sympathy. "Is she okay?" She's always been intense. I hope the child isn't caught in the middle. I was already painted as the storm. Anything I did was weather. Then came the suggestion that sounded like an offer. "Maybe you should apologize properly," someone said, "just to clear the air." Properly meant publicly. Properly meant accepting responsibility for things no one would name. Properly meant making it easier for everyone else to move on without changing anything. I understood then that they expected me to break, to cry, to beg, to confess to being the problem so they could stop feeling uneasy. I felt it, the pressure, the narrowing options, the way the room leaned toward a single outcome. And still, I didn't give them what they were waiting for. I didn't argue. I didn't collapse. I didn't perform remorse on cue. I stayed steady. because I was strong, because I was tired of saying words that were being used against me. I could feel the walls closing in, socially, emotionally, but something else was happening too, quietly. They were running out of ways to push without showing their hand. And I knew the next move, whatever it was, wouldn't be gentle. The moment itself was easy to miss. There was no decision announced in my head, no clear sentence like, "This is what I'm going to do now." It felt more like something loosening, like I had been holding my breath for a long time without realizing it, and my body finally stopped waiting for permission to exhale. I noticed it first in how I listened. When people spoke, I stopped preparing responses. I stopped trying to predict what they wanted to hear. I let their words arrive and sit there, unchanged by my need to smooth them over. And I heard more than I ever had before. Contradictions slipped out when no one was being challenged. Timelines didn't match. Stories bent slightly depending on who was in the room. The confidence they spoke with wasn't certainty, it was repetition. I realized something quietly, almost gently. Explaining myself had never protected me. It had only given them more material to work with. So I stopped explaining. The shift showed up in small ways. I asked for things in writing instead of verbally. I followed up conversations with short, neutral messages, just to confirm, for clarity. Nothing emotional, nothing defensive. No one reacted at first. Then they started to notice. "Why are you being so formal?" someone asked, half joking. "I just want to make sure I understand," I said. I started keeping records, not obsessively, not dramatically, just facts, dates, messages, what was said and when. I didn't tell anyone I was doing it. I didn't need to. I also stopped filling silence. When questions were asked that didn't make sense, I waited. When accusations were framed as concern, I let them finish. The pauses grew longer, uncomfortable. People rushed to fill them. I could feel the change inside me more than I could see it outside. The constant urge to prove myself eased, not because I felt safe, but because I no longer believed safety came from being understood. There was no relief yet, no sense of victory. If anything, I felt lonelier. Clearer, but lonelier. I knew this path wouldn't fix things quickly. It might not fix them at all. But for the first time, I wasn't trying to convince anyone of who I was. I was letting the truth sit where it landed. And I understood something else then, with a quiet certainty that didn't need reassurance. When things finally came into the open, they wouldn't need my voice to be loud. They would just need to be seen.
It didn't happen in the way I once imagined it might. There was no confrontation, no raised voices, no moment where someone suddenly apologized and everything made sense again. It unfolded in a room that felt almost boring in its order, chairs arranged evenly, papers stacked neatly, a clock ticking loud enough to notice. I sat there with my hands folded, the same way I always did, calm on the outside, steady. I wasn't there to convince anyone of anything. That part of me was done. They spoke first. Dates were read out, messages referenced, simple questions asked in neutral voices. Not accusations, just clarifications, the kind that don't leave much room to improvise. At first, everyone sounded confident, certain. They repeated the same explanations they always had, but this time, the words didn't move the room the way they used to. Someone paused. Someone asked for something to be repeated. Someone else flipped back a page. The air shifted, not dramatically, just enough to notice. I watched as small inconsistencies surfaced. Not lies exactly, just gaps, assumptions that hadn't been checked, decisions made on feelings, then remembered as facts. When I was asked to speak, I did, briefly. I didn't add context. I didn't share emotion. I stated what I knew, and how I knew it. Nothing more. There was a moment when my son looked at me, not the way he had been lately, guarded and distant, but searching. He was hearing things he hadn't before, not opinions, not warnings, just timelines lining up in a way that didn't support the story he'd been given. No one turned to me with anger. No one demanded explanations. Instead, the question shifted direction. I stayed quiet while others filled the space. Voices that used to sound certain now sounded careful. Words were chosen more slowly. The power in the room moved, almost imperceptibly. By the time it was over, nothing had been declared, no verdict announced. But something essential had changed.
I walked out the same way I'd walked in, calm, composed. Behind me, the story that had followed me for so long no longer held its shape. And for the first time, I didn't feel the urge to look back and see who noticed.
After that, things didn't suddenly feel lighter. They felt quieter. The phone rang less, messages came slower, more carefully worded. People seemed unsure of what tone to use with me now, like they were waiting for instructions I wasn't going to give. No one apologized outright. I didn't expect them to. Apologies would have required them to name what they'd done, and naming it would have meant sitting with it. Most people don't like to sit with things that don't flatter them. What did change was the way decisions were made. I was asked instead of informed, copied instead of excluded, listened to, not warmly, not affectionately, but respectfully. And I understood that this was as close to acknowledgement as I was likely to get. My son and I didn't have a dramatic conversation, no tearful reckoning, no speech where everything was explained and forgiven. We had smaller moments. A question asked instead of assumed, a pause before a judgment, a look that lingered a second longer than before. That was enough to tell me he was thinking, reprocessing, sorting through what he'd been told and what he'd seen for himself. I didn't rush him. I had learned what rushing does. I didn't forgive everyone, not fully. Forgiveness felt too neat for something that had changed the shape of how I moved through the world, but I let go of the need to be understood by people who had already decided who I was. I stopped apologizing for taking up space. Not out loud, just internally. The reflex faded. The urge to soften myself before speaking loosened its grip. What stayed with me wasn't anger. It was clarity. The kind that comes when you realize silence can be protection, not weakness, and that dignity doesn't need witnesses to be real. I still live carefully, still choose my words, but now I choose when to use them. And if this story felt familiar, if you've ever been asked to apologize for things you couldn't quite name, you're not alone. You don't have to explain yourself here. If you want to share your thoughts, they're welcome. If this kind of quiet truth matters to you, stay with me.